Well, we are so excited today to have Beth Golik with us from Key Ministry, and we are going to be talking about something that every church should know more about, which is universal design. So Beth, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, can you start by telling us a little bit more about Key Ministry and what you guys do?
Sure. So we're an organization that was founded a little over 20 years ago, and we help equip churches to welcome families, individuals and families impacted by disability. And our roots are really in those hidden disabilities and mental health conditions.
Right. So that would be probably like autism or...
And anything from like anxiety, ADHD, like things that you're probably, if you're in a children's ministry setting, you're seeing whether or not you or they know of an official diagnosis.
Right. So these are sometimes you see it within behavior,
yes,
but doesn't always have a diagnosis with it, or
yes, or you're hearing from your volunteers. There's this kid, ... and that could be a hidden disability in action. And so what we want to do is help equip churches to kind of understand what some of those hidden disabilities look like, particularly in a children's ministry setting, but then also, mental health conditions in general, and working with churches to just have a better awareness and then have an action plan.
Yeah, well, I can't say enough nice things about Key Ministry. We just moved our house last week, and I went through all of my old boxes, and I found when we started our disability ministry at my church 10 years ago, the whole guide I had printed out from Key Ministry's website. So,
I remember that well,
yes,
because 10 years ago, I was not on staff at Key Ministry, but I was on staff at a church, and I did the same thing.
Yeah. So we used your guideline to get us started as we started our disability ministry. You guys put out great stuff. Cannot recommend highly enough that people check out your organization.
Well, we love working with you, and we recommend you to a lot of people as well. So,
all right, that sounds great. Well, let's talk a little bit about universal design. For those who don't know what that is, can you kind of tell us about it?
Sure. So, in practice, what it is, it's a concept of making some small adjustments that help a few people, but in fact really benefits all people. Yeah. So I can give you an example.
Yeah.
And I'll start with an example from a children's ministry setting. Okay. So let's say you're doing, as part of your children's ministry program, there's maybe memory verses. So, learning a memory verse. So providing visuals to go along with that memory verse may help a couple of kids, because, we all learn differently, and some of us are visual learners, and some are, we learn through listening, and some we have to do, we're kinesthetic learners. But having visuals may help a few of those visual learners, but in reality, it helps all of the children. So that's just one, children's ministry example. There's all kinds of things that we can do that kind of fall under that universal design heading.
So basically what it means is when you're helping one child, you're really helping everyone.
Yes, exactly.
And that's kind of a shift of mindset for leaders, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. But I think once they can see some of these things in practice, I think that really it can contribute to a way of thinking that's really going to not just benefit the people that are already in our building, but make it a welcoming place where people are leaning in and saying, okay, I need to come check this out.
So I know when a lot of people think of universal design, we think about people may have physical handicaps, like a universal design would be having a ramp.
Ramp versus stairs, right, exactly, because the ramp helps the few that are, have like a mobility impairment where they need perhaps a wheelchair to get in. But we can all use a ramp.
Right. So
yes,
everyone.
Perfect example.
But how does that translate to the hidden disabilities that you were talking about?
Yeah. So let me give you one that maybe, hadn't thought of, but offering gluten-free communion is one. Because there are perhaps some people in your congregation who can't take communion because they can't have the gluten.
Right.
By changing all of the elements to gluten-free, you've now made that practice available for those few people, and yet everybody can still partake.
Right.
So that's kind of an interesting example, because that is, it's an obstacle for people being able to fully participate in the life of the church.
So I have visited your church a couple times for conferences, and one thing that has always stood out to me as soon as I go into your worship center is that there are children's Bibles right next to the adult Bibles. Every time I see it, I get like the warm fuzzies all over because I feel like anyone could be welcome there. Can you tell us why you guys chose to do that?
Yes, we have the Jesus Storybook Bible in the pews along with the ESV version is what we use. But our church is really like its history. Families have just been part of the church, and kind of it was founded from a Sunday school over 100 years ago. And so children and families are just a really big part of our church DNA. And so a few years back, the decision was made to include the children's Bibles in the pew. And just like if you don't have a Bible, you're welcome to take one of the Bibles home. The same thing goes for the children's Bible.
Yeah. So one of the questions I get a lot from people is, how do you get your whole church on board with disability inclusion? And I always come back to walking into your church and seeing those children's Bibles, the Storybook Bible there, because the way you do it is by incorporating as many universal design things as you can. So even you aren't having to educate people or tell people things, they feel it and they see it as soon as they walk in.
Yes.
Can you give us some more examples of how you guys have embraced universal design in your church?
Sure. And I will not hold us up as the perfect example either. But I will just tell you some examples that maybe our church has done and other churches have done. So in not just the children's ministry setting, but in like the larger setting, I think having areas that are more sensory friendly, that are available, and it's not a big deal if you have to use them. Let me put that one on hold for a second, because it's great to have those sensory friendly areas. So either like an area where you can walk around or have a little bit more distance between you and the action, like that's great. What's even better is if we are being sensory friendly from the beginning, and taking into account things like lighting and sound. So those are the two probably biggest like triggers for people who have sensory processing differences. So in my opinion, a church that is making sure that the lighting is not, flashing and just kind of over the top. Also making sure that there's enough light that people can read. If, the slides, having a high contrast, like a black slide with white font, white lettering, like that's terrific, because that works best it works really well for some that may have problems with, with their eyesight, but then it works for everybody.
Right.
So controlling the sound and the light, not going overboard in either direction, I think is huge, because it benefits, all people in addition to just the couple. Things like having ramps and just accessible restrooms and that type of thing, again, benefits a few, but just it really benefits everybody.
Yeah.
So those are just a couple examples of like facility type things, and like the lighting and all that. I think there's also a lot of it has to do with the attitude too.
Yeah.
Like this is just part of what we do, and not making it a big deal.
Have you talked to anyone who's gone to churches where they didn't have some of these things in place and they weren't able to come in? I think a lot of times we get so focused in our own viewpoint that we don't stop to think about someone's experience who can't come into something, or it's very difficult.
Right. And I think if it's not part of your personal experience or your family's experience, you might not even be aware of some of these things. So, I mean, lighting and sound is right up there. If you yourself are not, like, if flashing lights don't bother you, maybe it doesn't cross your mind. They, like, personally, they bother me. So, like, that's something I'm very aware of. And I've been in services or like concert type settings. I can't be, I mean, it doesn't like trigger a seizure in me or anything like that, but it bothers me too much to be part of it.
I feel this. So I have some sensory issues, and I feel the same way, especially about the loud volume and flashing lights. I mean, forget it. But what I think people need to understand, if you don't have these things, you probably have other things in your life that you're sensitive to, and it's really important to draw on what that feels like for you when you're looking around. Because I know, like, for me, when I go into a church and it's so loud, and there's lights and all of that, and not just I can't come in, I leave that church environment feeling terrible. And so my association with that church is bad. So if I'm an unchurched person that's coming in for the first time, I leave with the feeling that church is unsafe. And I think that's what a lot of people are missing, because we and I do this too, but we are so familiar with what triggers us or what is hard for us that we forget there's all these other things that are hard for other people and inspire the same feelings. So how do you train ministry leaders to know what needs to be changed or what needs universal design? How do they approach it?
So, like, when I talk to churches, and especially when it comes to worship service, and I think a lot of this, I mean, yes, there's things like ramps and like physical things, but a lot of what we're talking about right now, like a worship service, a lot of it has to do with sensory things, honestly. And so there are kind of 5 things that I like to talk to churches about. So one is the lighting, and one is the sound. And again, yes, we can provide headphones, noise canceling headphones, but why don't we just work on, like, instead of just trying to find all these like little, fixes, let's just, Another one is let people know what to expect. So maybe it's providing a schedule. That can really help alleviate anxiety in people, those who have both diagnosed anxiety or just who are anxious people. That's a huge one for me. Like, I don't want to be completely surprised. I don't want to go in and not know if it's going to be a 2-hour service or a 30-minute, I want to know a little bit of what to expect, what's next. And so there are all kinds of things we as churches can do to provide that information to people, whether they're new to our church or, come every Sunday or whatever it is. And so we have all kinds of ideas for that. But everything from, info on your website, to let people know, like, what kind of clothes do people wear? Because that can be a huge barrier for somebody to walk through your front door. Yeah, it really can. And so anyway, so providing a schedule. Also, I think, again, we talked about how we learn best in different ways. Right. And being able to provide sort of an interactive, this really works in children's ministry, but being able to provide an interactive experience. So, for those of us who kind of need to get our wiggles out every now and then, maybe there's, some time where you're standing, not just sitting the whole time, that type of thing. But just making it interactive so it reaches a variety of learning styles. The 5th thing when I talk to churches, and again, this is more kind of on the sensory friendly side, probably than the I'm just going to say it's universal design, but setting the tone. That, we all worship differently, and it might look, this person might move more, this person you might hear them more, but setting the tone that this is how we were designed, and we're designed to worship God, and it's all good and it's all okay. And just setting that expectation for the entire congregation, I think that's hugely important.
I agree with that. Do you think that that really is the role of the lead pastor as far as the different worship styles? Because I think sometimes people can get comfortable with their own worship style and maybe what they've been used to. And when they see someone who is more demonstrative, sometimes they feel like it's wrong or someone needs to tell them to stop. Who needs to set that tone that every worship style is okay, that we're here to, worship however God made you to worship?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a message that we can't, we can't not say enough. Is that too many? We can't say enough. Like it needs to be, I think it needs to be said from the pulpit. I think it needs to be demonstrated by our worship leaders. I think it needs to be, involve people that worship differently. That maybe are more demonstrative, or maybe they're minimally verbal, but they show their worship in other ways. Invite them to be part of what you're doing, what the congregation is seeing. I mean, how beautiful if we can see all the different ways that people worship.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's what I'm hearing you say is embrace it. If you see differences, embrace them. I think too often we try to just hope no one notices, or maybe next time they'll be quiet. But that's kind of defeating the purpose of spiritually growing each person to the person that God made them to be, and we're to embrace them. I love that.
Yeah, I don't want to point out specific people, but I will tell you, in our children's ministry setting, we have one young man who just worships so incredibly beautifully with so much pure joy, that I hope that we get the opportunity to bring him in to worship in front of the entire congregation, because that is how we should all be worshiping.
I agree.
We should all be with that abandon, with that joy. That's what we should, and so often we're all just concerned about how we look and that type of thing. We need to be, I won't say his name, but we need to be like him.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then I would just add this to it. If you are a ministry leader and you're listening to this and you're thinking, but you don't understand that's going to make people uncomfortable, I want you to say, good, because uncomfortable is where we want our people. If all your people are comfortable all the time, guess who's not growing?
Right.
When we become uncomfortable and we have to stretch and embrace differences and learn, that is when our congregations have the chance to become more spiritually mature.
Amen.
So, I love that. Okay, so we talked a lot about sensory stuff, and we'll put some resources up for that. Can you talk a little bit about universal design in learning? So when we're in the classrooms, what are some techniques maybe some teachers can use to help engage everyone, not just the kids who sit quietly and listen?
Yes, that's good. So I think just being aware about the different learning styles is really important. I believe, especially in the children's ministry setting, it's a really good idea to incorporate a little bit of each of those into everything. I'm not just talking about sensory classrooms or special needs classrooms. I'm talking about all of children's ministry. So I think having visuals for pretty much everything. So for your memory verse, I think having schedules, like visual schedules for pretty much anything. So as an example, we were using visual schedules for a couple of students in our special needs ministry classrooms that needed, for their behavior plan, for their anxiety, they needed to be able to check off things as we would go through the morning. Well, we incorporated that into our large group settings. This is for all of elementary, K through 4. And we project it up on the screen. And as we go through each part of large group, so worship, memory verse, Bible basics, story. All the kids do a big check with their hands as we go through each thing. So it was designed for 2 students, and it's now being used by the entire children's ministry setting, So, so schedules is, a huge example.
Let me stop you real quick.
Yeah.
When you did that change, did you notice any differences in the group behavior? Did it improve, or was it the same or worse?
For sure. No, it definitely, they are like zeroed in when that chart comes up, because they all do the check. Like nobody's not paying attention when it's time to do the check.
So that actually made your volunteers' jobs easier when you incorporated universal design?
Yes, because the kids know what to expect. Mm-hmm. And so, they're able to kind of adjust their behavior. They know that they're going to be standing up when we do worship, and, so they can sit for this time because they know they're going to be able to get up and move. Yeah. And that type of thing. So we stick to the same schedule every single week. Yeah. Which I think, again, is a good, good idea for children's ministry. Repetition is important. Having a pretty set schedule, I think, benefits a lot of students.
And I'm going to stop here for just a second, because I think this is so important. I think people miss it a lot. When we're talking about this universal design, especially in the children's ministry setting, we talk a lot about how it benefits certain kids and that it can benefit all kids, but truly it benefits your volunteer team, and it benefits you as a leader, because you will retain volunteers more if your children feel comfortable. This is one place we want people to feel comfortable. Yes. If your children feel like they're not as anxious because the supports are built in. So that actually makes the ministry leaders' lives easier when we add these things in.
100% yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah. It alleviates so much anxiety on the part of the students, which then kind of translates into for the leaders as well. Yes.
So when the anxiety is alleviated for the students, that generally creates better behavior. Yes. Correct?
Yes, absolutely.
And better behavior generally creates better retention of your volunteers.
Happier.
That's how we're going. Okay, universal design for the win. Okay.
Yeah. I think in the children's ministry setting, incorporating some movement, so whether it's, doing some ASL, doing, in songs, doing clapping or marching in place or whatever, that really helps engage our kinesthetic learners. Mm-hmm. When you're, transitioning to different activities, there may be some activities that are either too social, too chaotic for all of your students. And so having some different options, I think, is a really good idea. I'm not quite sure that falls under universal design, but maybe it does if you say, always providing, everybody doesn't have to do everything. So providing a couple of different options. So for the kids that do better in a quieter environment or a calmer environment, they can be successful. But then you also provide that opportunity for the kids that need a little bit more structure, engagement, and movement.
Yeah. I personally think that it is a type of universal design, is options. And let's talk about that for just a minute. Yeah. One question I get a lot from churches and church leaders is it okay to ever have a separate environment for students with disabilities? So we talk about universal design, which is where we're putting in adaptions to make it as supportive as possible for everyone, no matter what the ability level. But then another option is to have a completely separate environment where the entire environment is adapted for students with disabilities. What is your thoughts on having those options?
Yes, thank you for asking. Here are my thoughts. Yeah. So I think we want students to, experience church, experience worship, grow in their faith in the least restrictive, most inclusive environment possible. Right. And for so many of our students with disabilities, that means they are in their grade level environment with And they're being successful either because the universal design elements that have been implemented are meeting their needs, or they're being provided some additional support, whether that's like a buddy or some other tools or strategies that are helping adapt the environment enough that they're being successful there. Or maybe they're going to be more successful in an environment that can be adapted even further. And so I will not say that only a fully inclusive environment is the best, or only a completely separate environment is the best. I think depending on the student, and it may be depending on the season, one environment is going to work better than the other. And I don't think anybody, because they have a disability, gets placed in the whatever that you're going to call that classroom. But I think in some cases having that option is the best, the most successful environment for the student. And I mean, I can just tell you from from my experience at this church that there are families who are here because there's that environment.
Yeah. So I know this is kind of a debated topic, but for the record, you and I are in a complete agreement on it. That's the same way we approach it as well. And what I like to tell churches is I personally think it's okay to have a separate environment as an option. What you're trying not to do is you only have that. It's either no adaptions in the general classroom, nothing, and a separate environment. But we don't want that. What we want is we want to put the adaptions in the general classroom. So that is an option for students that thrive there. But it's okay to have a separate environment that's even further tailored to students with disabilities as an option for children too.
And I would say at my church, we're doing all three of those things that I mentioned. So if you were to pan a video around our children's ministry setting, you're going to see you're not going to see it because they're students who their needs are being met because we have implemented some of these universal design ideas. You're going to see students who are in their grade level group, but you can see that there are some adaptions that we've made. And then you're going to see some students who are in the sensory friendly group where it's a separate classroom, we worship together, but then there's a separate classroom environment for when they need a break. So you can see all three.
That's exactly the same way we do it at our church, 100%. So I would just like to encourage people, if you're asking that question, the answer is yes, yes, and yes. You want to have, if you can, have all of it because you really want to be able to have options. I do 100% think options is part of universal design. Options for people where they thrive the most. And I don't know if you get this question, Beth, but another question I get is, how do you decide where a student's going to go? Well, for us, we like to involve the families in that, the families and the students. And so I think if you can work something out that works for the family and for the student and for the church, that's what you want. So
yeah, I mean, just to give you an example, and again, not to name any names, but just this week, we got contacted by a mom with a very young child who's on the spectrum. And so she wants to know, is there a place for her daughter? And yeah, I mean, just because she's on the spectrum doesn't mean she's going to end up in one of my classrooms.
Right.
That's an option.
Right.
Wherever she's going to thrive. Yeah. And, when I talk to churches and, we're talking about these different things, but these aren't necessarily huge, big programs. Okay.
Right.
So we can talk about just one, do for that one student that one family that you already know is there.
Yes.
You're not having to build a wing or whatever.
Right.
Work with who you have right now and figure out what environment they're going to succeed in.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So going again with the options, so we talked earlier about the sensory-friendly worship and how it really is important if we can do some universal design on that as far as volume and lighting, not just because there are people like me who are sensitive to that and can't actually come into the worship and have to leave because of it, but you actually have people with epilepsy and traumatic brain injuries who, from a health standpoint, that is dangerous.
Yes.
So yes, let's turn the volume down and no flashing lights. But in also with that, sometimes people like to do sensory-friendly worship environments as special nights that invite the community in. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So again, I'm not going to offer my church as the perfect example, but it's something that we're kind of striving towards, and we've done this a few times. So in my opinion, the biggest thing that you can do when, if you're billing it as sensory friendly, is setting the expectation. So you are, from the get-go, you are welcome here. And like setting the expectation with the congregation, with whoever's coming in from the community, like it's okay if your kid is twirling, if your adult family member is vocalizing, like it's good. And we're glad you're here. Yeah. So to me, that's the number one thing. Obviously you're not going to do crazy things with lighting. You're not going to do crazy things with sound. You'll have some of those things available, like, you want to make sure it's fully accessible. Have headphones and some fidgets or whatever, just to make it a more welcoming environment. But I think the biggest thing is setting the expectation, like, if you need to get up and walk around, that's fine. If your kid's going to come up here and dance, that's great. Like it's good, and we're glad you're here.
Yeah. Now, your church had a sensory-friendly Christmas Eve service, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us about that?
Yes. It was one of the most favorite things that I've been able to be part of. So what made it different than our regular children's ministry service for Christmas Eve? So we had it in a smaller worship area. So it was a little bit more intimate. Like, it wasn't our big sanctuary. And we had the seating set up so that it was a much more casual environment, like a family. We had like beanbag chairs and couches instead of just pews. And so we really wanted to set the stage, like, just come as you are, be yourself, you were welcome here. So the way it was set up was a little different. Every participant got a little bag with some things in it. So as we went through and taught the Christmas story, and knowing that the Christmas story starts with creation, goes through everything. So it's not just the birth of Jesus, but it's the whole story, the whole gospel story. We had little manipulatives or fidgets, so that so I would tell a part of the story and do the little fidget with them. So for instance, when we taught about creation, we had a little squishy earth ball, so they could squeeze it while we talked about creation. And then a pastor would read scripture and talk about that a little bit, and then we would do a worship song. So we had a visual schedule, and we followed that schedule. It was very repetitive. So it was my piece with they had an interactive thing with it, and then the scripture, and then the song. And it was just this beautiful time. One of my students came up and literally laid at my feet. And at first her mom was like, "Oh no, I'll get her off the stage." And it's like, "This is perfect. And she laid there and listened. And it was just beautiful. And we had some people from the community that don't attend our church, and they just felt really welcomed, and just the opportunity to experience a Christmas Eve service when maybe they wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, I think that's one of the beautiful things about having some events that are for the disability community is if someone is not already in a church, I think it would feel safer to try that first. And that's important, because again, if you're not someone who has grown up with disability or has had that as a big part of your life, it's hard to imagine what it feels like to walk into a place that you've never been before with someone whose behavior is not meeting the social norms.
Right.
And so, again, I think options. We want to make everything as inclusive as possible in every environment within our church, but it's also okay to have some separate events too, because that does, I think it shows love when we do it in both places, when we do it all over.
And along those lines, I mean, just to give an example, but like if a church decides to do like a dance or a prom or like a night to shine type of thing, not that you wouldn't fight for inclusiveness at like the local high school prom, you would, but there are some individuals who, for medical reasons or they can't attend that environment. I mean, I have families that they can come to Night to Shine because we've created such an environment, like it's completely designed for the needs of their son or daughter.
Yeah.
So I think it's a both and.
That's what I think too.
Yeah.
So when churches are looking at their different ministries and asking, what is it that we're missing? How can they get there? How important is it to invite people in the disability community to help them?
Yeah. So they need to have a seat at the table. You don't know what you don't know. And so if nobody in the decision-making or sitting around the decision-making table, if nobody is impacted by disability, either personally or in their family, or if you don't have somebody who's representing that, these changes aren't going to be made. Because if you're planning an event and you have no idea what the needs of some of the families that attend your church are, you're not going to be able to take those things into account. So it's important that there's somebody at that table who can represent the needs of the families that we're talking about.
Absolutely. So Beth, now that we've been talking about all of this, do you have any personal stories you would want to share or anything you would want people to know what this really feels like for people when we make this extra step?
Yeah, I can think of a story and this one just like hit me so hard, but so our church did a sensory-friendly worship night. And so what we meant by that was it was an all-church worship night where the worship team, like those that plan events, really took into account some of these things that we've been talking about. So everything from the level of the music was a little lower than it normally is. The stage was set with like setting the expectation. Like I actually got to go up and set the expectations, which was fun. Yeah. The teaching was very interactive. But it was such a beautiful time of worship. And I had a mom come up to me later, and she was with her 20-something-year-old daughter who is, minimally verbal. And she was so thrilled for the opportunity to worship with her daughter and see her daughter in worship. And she said she knows like that's what heaven's going to be like. And her daughter will be leading worship in heaven. And it was just like the thought that they don't get to experience the worshiping together like that on a regular basis. It just really drove home the importance of we need to be doing this all the time.
We do, because church is for everyone.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. So I heard you guys have a podcast at Key Ministry. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So it's a weekly podcast. There are 5 of us that are the co-hosts.
Yeah.
So Sandra Peoples and Catherine Boyle, who's the Director of Mental Health Ministry for Key Ministry, and Garrett Wall and Dr. Lamar Hardwick and me. And so it's a weekly podcast for ministry leaders. We cover a variety of topics, and you can check it out on any, wherever you find your favorite podcast. But the transcripts are all at keyministry.org/podcast. And there are a couple podcast episodes that have to do with the very topic we've discussed today. So, so universal design, sensory-friendly worship, and some of those types of things.
All right. Well, we thank you so much for being with us today. I think this has been a really important discussion, and I cannot wait to see how churches take what they're learning and truly make a more inclusive, universal church for everyone.
Absolutely.